Welcome back to Nate the Hate, and with me as always is our favorite Australian mate, MVG. So say hello.
What's up? What's up, Nate? What's up, listeners? Thanks for having me back on.
It's always a pleasure to have you here. So for everyone listening, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. And today we're going to talk about the coronavirus and its potential impacts it's going to have on the video game industry in 2020 and potentially beyond. So up to this point, we have seen the coronavirus impact the video game industry in several different ways. With PAX East, we have seen Capcom, Square Enix, and Sony completely remove themselves from the event. Capcom canceled a Monster Hunter Festa event that was being hosted in Boston this weekend. Square Enix was supposed to have a panel and an autograph session with some of the voice actors from Final Fantasy VII Remake. They have canceled that. Sony has removed themselves completely from the show. And we've also seen companies remove themselves from the Game Developers Conference, also known as GDC, which takes place next month. And that includes Sony, Facebook, and news came out today that Hideo Kojima is removing Kojima Productions from GDC, where they were supposed to have two keynotes where they were going to discuss Death Stranding in greater detail. And they've now announced that they're going to no longer attend the event. And outside of the gaming world, we also had an event in Barcelona known as the Mobile World Congress. It was supposed to take place this week, and a bunch of the vendors decided to cancel their attendance, leading to the entire event being scrapped. And there is no confirmed cases of the coronavirus in Barcelona. But because it is an international event, a lot of the exhibitors cited concerns about the coronavirus, and they just canceled the event outright. And that's what we're going to talk about today is, are we going to see more impacts of the coronavirus in the video game industry as the year progresses? And MVG and I have each done a little independent research on this topic and outside of the topic to see if the video game industry has faced this type of crisis in recent history. And I believe MVG looked into the SARS epidemic to see if it had any impact on the video game industry to a tier that we're seeing now from the coronavirus. And what did you find out?
Well, the first thing about SARS was it was something that lasted for about 8 months, which is a lot longer than I remember. I kind of, for whatever reason, I felt like it was only, a few months and it had kind of disappeared, but it was actually an 8-month period, and there was 8,000 people that were affected and 774 deaths in total, which is a lot less than what we're seeing so far with the coronavirus, obviously, because we're talking the death toll is 2,500 or something like that.
Yeah, several thousands, and the affected are well over 75,000 now.
But the interesting thing about SARS is that it hit a lot of countries. It hit 29 countries in total, that is a lot of the world that got infected. Now, that's not to say that's not going to happen with the coronavirus, but SARS was interesting because it didn't really have any effect on the industry, at least from the research that I've done. And I think the reasons for it are because, number one, the industry was a lot smaller back then. So there was, I guess the risk was a lot less kind of risk averse to things like this. But also it was one of those diseases, and I remember it was just kind of business as usual. The consensus was, let's just kind of fight through this. Let's power through this, and everything's going to work itself out. And that's pretty much what happened with SARS. But in this instance, this is a completely different situation. And I think that the companies that have chosen to remove themselves from conferences and cease production of whatever they're working on, I think it's a very smart move on their behalf. And the other thing, Nate, is that you touched on a lot of the impacts, but there was also the Taipei game show that was cancelled.
Right.
Nintendo Switch production has been disrupted. The Oculus Quest production's been disrupted. We talked about the Outer Worlds a couple of weeks ago. There's other things as well. There's kind of esports events. There's the Valve Index, the VR device that's been disrupted. This is not just console games and mobile, and you mentioned mobile as well. This is a very significant disease that potentially could affect the rest of the year and have serious implications and delays on things that are coming up throughout the calendar year.
Right. That's like one thing I don't think a lot of people really realize is how time restricted the game industry really is. And companies they map out their plans for a year well in advance. Like we have Sony and Microsoft both. They have intentions to launch the PlayStation 5 and the Series X in holiday 2020. But as we see with the Nintendo Switch manufacturing, which is going to be impacted likely by April, as Nintendo was forecasting, if the manufacturing lines in China are not back up to full operation by roughly, we'll say June or July, the impacts that's going to have on Sony and potentially Microsoft for the next gen launches to be this holiday, that's when we're going to see potential effects.
Now, Sony tells us that this isn't going to affect the timeline they have for the PlayStation 5. Do you think that is something that is just, I don't want to say marketing speak, but is that something that you feel like they're saying, well, that's what we believe right now, but things may change?
Yeah, I think I don't want to use the term marketing speak either. I think it is executive speak to the shareholders to make sure their stock price doesn't get influenced by the unknown. They have to say, they pretty much have to come out and say, right now, everything's on schedule.
Right.
And I mean, right now it is, because they have not begun manufacturing and they can't predict the future of how the virus is going to impact manufacturing lines, or even how they are going to get certain, those precious minerals and everything else that China does, ship and provide for hardware. So I think it's just them maintaining the status quo, and they're not really going to view those unknowns just yet. Now, that could change once their fiscal year ends and they have to actually forecast their next generation plans, but it's still a little too early for them to probably express concern at this point. I think if we hit midsummer and they're still saying, yeah, we're going to hit this holiday, and the coronavirus has not subsided, potentially, let's say it spreads and it becomes a bigger challenge for the World Health Organization, and the impacts on the game industry are still, what they are today. You still have developers shut down in China. You have even Japan is being affected now to a certain degree.
Yep.
You'd have to wonder if then they would come out and say, well, maybe we're just going to do a regional launch of the PlayStation 5. We're going to have, we're going to launch in November in North America. Japanese release hasn't been decided yet. Europe, we're hoping to target early 2021. I think that's a realistic possibility we could see play out if the situation does not change from today.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I also wonder where Microsoft fits in all this, because they've been pretty quiet about, what's going on there, and maybe they're not impacted by it at the moment, but you got to feel as if that they would be impacted in the same way, but maybe they're just choosing to, I guess, keep that stuff closer to their chest at the moment, versus Microsoft, versus Sony, who is obviously, international company, and they're flying in people from overseas. Microsoft obviously has the luxury of not having to worry about that for the most part, except for obviously their, overseas employees that would be required to attend events and things like that. But what do you think about Microsoft as far as where they fit in all this? Because they have to be impacted by this as well.
Right. I would imagine Microsoft has to be in the exact same situation as Sony, where they're just, I think the only luxury Microsoft has in this situation, I use the term luxury, loosely here, is that Microsoft is primarily a North American focused company. So if they had to choose a regional launch, they're not going to be as concerned about having units ready for like Japan. So if they can only manufacture 2 million units for a November launch, Microsoft will say, we're putting all 2 million of those units in North America. We'll get to, Europe later. Japan's probably not even really a focus for us because it definitely wasn't with the Xbox One. Whereas Sony is that we want Japan, North America, Europe, the Middle East. They want to get that whole worldwide distribution. So they need more units to reach that goal. And Microsoft is still a very American focused company. So that may assist them a little bit in this regard, but it's tough to really predict based on, what could happen.
What do you think about and I don't agree with this, by the way, but I want to ask you the question. What do you think about the idea or the opinion that Sony is doing this in order to control the timeline of the next generation better versus, being, I don't want to say playing second fiddle, but waiting and seeing what Microsoft's doing before they make a move? They've come out now, they've said, look, we're putting a hold on some things because of this virus. Is that going to impact the PlayStation 5 delay? And if so, do you think that, this is just a scapegoat or, something that they're just kind of throwing out there in order to potentially delay the system because they are legitimately not ready to launch?
Yeah, I've seen that conspiracy theory be tossed around, and I think it's a load of bollocks. I mean, it's actually insulting.
I agree.
To even put that out there of, Sony didn't need PAX. They're using the virus as a scapegoat because they just didn't want to attend. No, Sony's out millions of dollars with PAX East.
Yeah,
they already booked the space. They likely already began some booth construction, or at least put in the orders to get signage and everything ready. Sony's out a lot of money by pulling out of PAX East at this point.
Right.
GDC,
literally a week before, right?
Yeah. It wasn't even a month early. It was a week to 10 days early. So, yeah. This was obviously a decision that they had been evaluating for a little bit of time. It wasn't just they woke up Monday morning last week and said, I don't want to go to PAX East. It was something, as a company, they investigated, evaluated, weighed the variables, and came to this conclusion of, we're not attending. And all the people sitting there saying, they just pulled out because the PlayStation 5 isn't ready, or they might delay the PlayStation 5, and they're just blaming it on the coronavirus. No, the video game industry doesn't need these type of conspiracy theories and rumors that are based on, the hunch of a forum goer who's just trying to be like, Sony's afraid of Microsoft. Let's conveniently use this worldwide, pandemic, and we can explain why the PlayStation 5 might not come out this holiday.
Yeah.
Sony's not playing a game of 4D chess here. They're evaluating the reality of the situation and just saying, we're not going to put our workers, our executives at health's risk for, some marketing points at a convention like PAX East. There was Yoshida was supposed to attend PAX East.
Yep.
He was supposed to have a panel.
That's right.
Now you wouldn't want him to potentially contract a serious virus by attending, let's be honest, a trivial, unsubstantial fan event.
Mm-hmm.
And there are bigger forces at play than PAX East and GDC. And even with GDC, that is a very important event for the industry. It's where developers and publishers meet, they talk. Microsoft and Sony would have been at GDC to meet with developers and publishers and talk about their plans with the PlayStation 5 and Series X, to potentially hand out some dev kits to some of the smaller studios, or maybe even updated dev kits to some of the bigger third-party studios of the world. And for Sony to cancel that, it means they're taking this very seriously, but they'll still communicate with these companies by email,
absolutely.
by telephone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, business is still going to continue. I don't think it's going to just completely stop. Now, you did touch on the Mobile World Congress. Sony had cancelled their appearance there as well. Amazon did as well, and Apple has come out recently and also restricted employee travel. So, I mean, to your point,
Wow.
any big organization, corporation, company that is involved with tech, electronics, video games, they're taking this very, very seriously, as they should. The consensus is this is a global concern. Anything that is non-essential travel is not going to happen. But what about Nintendo? Because Nintendo will be at PAX, and they will be there, business as usual. And they haven't really come out and said anything other than, obviously, the Switch. They talked about the stock, potentially being affected. But as far as events, they haven't said, no, we're not going to be attending events. They're going to be attending events. So where do they fit? Because Nintendo's interesting to me because they are obviously a Japanese company as well, and they would be flying in their people from overseas to attend these events. So they would be in a very similar situation, you would think, as Sony would be, but they have not come out yet at this time and said that, hey, we're not doing this, or we are continuing to do this. What do you think? What do you think the play there is with Nintendo?
Nintendo's definitely interesting to view because they're typically that company who always plays it safe in every other realm, and they're still attending PAX East, and they still have an Animal Crossing panel planned for GDC, and they are flying in producers and developers right from their headquarters in Japan. And I wonder I assume Nintendo, just like Sony, Microsoft, Apple, all these other companies, they are evaluating the situation, and they're just viewing it saying, well, we don't see enough of a risk right now, so we're going to go, business as usual. And maybe as GDC gets closer, if the coronavirus continues to spread, if there isn't any substantial progress made towards a vaccine, maybe Nintendo will reevaluate their stance.
Yeah, you got to think that they must have some advisors that are giving them literally daily updates on how, the situation. And I think all the companies would have a similar person or persons at their disposal.
Right, definitely. And that's where it's definitely interesting of just how Nintendo is really that one company that seems to be going against the industry trend and how they're approaching this. Because I believe, if we really look at Sony, I wouldn't be shocked to learn if Sony has some sort of travel ban on the business, similar to Apple or Amazon. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that at this point. And Nintendo's still kind of sitting here saying, we're going to travel everywhere. We know our Switch hardware stock is going to be impacted by this, but otherwise, we're still going to attend these events as scheduled. And I've seen analysts go to Twitter saying I was supposed to attend an event in, Paris next month, and the company I represent has canceled their appearance at said event. And I don't know if maybe Nintendo's advisors who are evaluating the situation have more information than others, or they're just viewing it as, maybe it's not that big of a deal in their opinion. But I'd like to think that they are taking the proper precautions. They are evaluating everything. Or, Nintendo is that type of company where they are a lot more restrictive in who they see, who's allowed into certain panels and such. So maybe like at GDC, it's not going to be open to tons of people for the panel. It's going to be maybe more of an invite-only list.
Right.
So they have a better idea of who is in attendance. And I mean, like for PAX East, it'd be primarily their, Nintendo of America employees. So there's really, they're probably not too concerned in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
Or, maybe they're equipping everybody with the proper, hand sanitizer, simple basic necessities for proper hygiene. But it is curious as how different Nintendo is approaching the situation than everyone else. And I'm curious to see if they're going to maintain this, tracking as we get closer to E3.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is not something that you can just say, this is the way it is. I think this is definitely I don't want to say day by day, but probably a week by week situation where things change either for the better or for the worse, and then the companies will pivot in the appropriate direction that they feel is the right thing to do. But honestly, Nate, if this situation deteriorates and gets worse, then I think we're going to see more of this stuff happening throughout the year. There potentially could be more companies pull out of E3. If the situation isn't kind of in a better spot, let's say by the middle of this year, forget about new hardware releases of consoles, but then we start talking about Tokyo Game Show and Gamescom. We start getting to that Q3 type stuff, and that's something that really you can't take off the table as well. I think that the key thing here is the travel bans that are going on right now really is just for precaution more than anything. The goal, I think, is to kind of nip it in the bud, get this virus under control, start seeing some statistics and numbers that are showing, the world and people that the virus is starting to go away, to kind of die off, and then kind of reassess. But if it's a situation where things just continue to get worse, then we may see some more cancellations, delays, whatever, as the year goes on. And I think, you mentioned SARS at the start. This is unprecedented what we're going through right now in video games and tech. This is not something that I've ever experienced before with video games, and no one has. I mean, it's something that it's very, very interesting to see. I mean, there could be potentially a lot of money that's lost this year in the video game industry. Yeah,
and I think that's a good way to pivot into like the next focus of the conversation that we're going to go to is the potential that the coronavirus can have on the video game industry throughout this year and into 2021. Like we've touched on like E3 and Tokyo Game Show and how this is really an unprecedented event. We really don't know what next week holds. And even GDC, I do suspect more companies will be withdrawing from it as the hours tick on. And like we saw it with the Outer Worlds, it's been delayed due to the impact of the coronavirus impacting the porting studio Virtuos that is stationed in China. We've seen the Switch and Nintendo coming out and saying we're going to have hardware shortages starting in April or May, right after Animal Crossing launches. Because that's basically, they came out and said that because the manufacturing lines were hit in late January and early February. So typically, about 1 to 2 months you need to manufacture units. And now you have to wonder, are we going to see more software, delays and even hardware delays happening as we advance into the year? Because with Nintendo already expecting shortages coming in just over 6 weeks, we already have one definite game delay impacted by this. What does the future potentially hold in terms of software and hardware delays moving forward?
Right. Great question. And a lot of people are probably wondering, we're talking about this, they're saying, well, how is software impacted by this? How does writing a game or game development get impacted. Obviously, the Virtuos thing, is different, but a US game developer or a Canadian one, Ubisoft, how would they potentially or possibly be affected by the virus? The answer to that is that most of these studios, most of these big companies have a Chinese arm. So Ubisoft has one.
Right. Yeah. Ubisoft has the Singapore studio.
They have the Shanghai studio as well. There's a lot of these companies will either outsource or they'll have some presence in China. And if that makes up we'll say a core group of people that are key people or a key team in the development life cycle, then all of a sudden that's the delay, and that's something that will obviously have a knock-on effect to your potential timeline and launch window and due date for getting the game published in gold and everything like that. So there's a lot of studios that do rely on Chinese developers and Chinese teams. There's QA departments that are out there. There's all sorts of different teams that a lot of companies rely on to get their work done. So, yeah, software can very easily be impacted as well. It's not just the assembly lines and the production lines in Shenzhen and places like that. This is affecting both sides of the spectrum.
So, like right now, like the Outer Worlds delay happened the way it did because the game was slated to come out in March due to the timing of the coronavirus impacting Virtuos and causing basically, a shutdown at the studio. What timetable would you say we're probably looking at for something like, we'll use Ubisoft just as the example of like the next Assassin's Creed game. If that was scheduled to come out this October, what timescale would you say we're looking at for the situation to change if Ubisoft's still relying on their Asian partners to do the outsourcing and the asset creation? When would they need to really be back into full production at the porting studio to still hit that deadline without facing significant crunch?
Oh, man, that's a great question. I would say pretty damn soon, honestly, Nate. I think that it would be within the next couple of months, if they had to get something ready. You said October?
Yeah, let's say, because typically we see the Assassin's Creed games release, mid to late October.
Honestly, I would say no later than May, June. And that's probably, they're starting to crunch at that point if that's what happens.
So, I mean, like we could, if nothing changes within the next, we'll say 8 weeks, a lot of those, potentially those big holiday games that people look forward to that have been announced, we may not be seeing those games released this year. Like that's a realistic outcome here. And I mean, it's one of those moments where we do have to realize, at the end of the day, it's just video games. Mm-hmm. The lives, the health of everyone being impacted and who could potentially be impacted by the coronavirus is far more precious than having Assassin's Creed release, in October of 2020.
Right.
And I think that's kind of one of those, kind of a thing some people forget when they discuss this, especially with the video game industry, because people become focused on, like, the PlayStation 5. Like, oh, is it going to release this holiday? Like, you know what? Human life is more important than you getting your PlayStation 5 in November.
Absolutely.
But for software-wise, if we're really looking at a situation where if they're not back at, in full work by, as you say, May, June, July, I mean, we could really be seeing a year for the video game industry where you're going to see a lot of companies, if you have to roll out those delays, the potential, like the financial impact it's going to have on companies could be, enormous. It could be immeasurable.
Yeah, it would potentially wipe out some of the smaller studios, potentially, if they don't get, if they're not VC backed or have enough kind of cash in the bank. But it could potentially have an impact on some of the smaller studios that are kind of waiting for, the holiday season to get their kind of titles out in order to get, money and make money on their sales. I mean, obviously, companies like Ubisoft, they'll be okay, that they'll be fine, but there is a good possibility that we will see delays, absolutely. And you're right. I mean, I think if it's May, June, July, and the situation is not under control, then buckle up, because it could be a while before we get back on track with what we were expecting as far as the schedule of hardware and software releases.
I think like software, I've looked into whether or not game manufacturing, as far as like the game cards and disc manufacturing, could be impacted by it. And what I learned was that most of them, like Sony, Microsoft, even Nintendo, is that they have regional manufacturing centers. Like Nintendo has one in Mexico.
Yeah.
So as far as like actual game distribution, whatever games are releasing, we shouldn't see any shortages or stock shortages in regards to new releases because of the impacts that the Chinese manufacturing lines are having. So that seems mostly confined to the hardware element of the industry right now. And like with Nintendo already coming out saying we're going to have shortages, the uncertainty of how this is going to play a role with Microsoft and Sony moving forward, simply because it's way too soon to know. Where in February, they really don't need to begin, pressing those systems and the manufacturing line until around July. You really need you need a good 4 months of manufacturing to hit your holiday launch, because you typically start around 500,000 units a month, and then you gear up to manufacturing 1 million units a month. So they have, there's still a lot of time for that. But you have to think, especially if Microsoft does plan on having Lockhart and Series X, if maybe they're evaluating those plans right now, saying, if we can't produce both to have launch on the same day, do you launch Lockhart 6 months later?
Mm-hmm.
Like, there has to be a lot of internal discussions going around at these companies. And I mean, it really is a game of, we have to just wait and see.
I mean, Microsoft could very easily launch the Series X in North America first, then in Europe, early next year, and then in Japan, honestly, a few months later than that. I don't think it would make a huge difference over there. But as far as Lockhart goes, yeah, I mean, do you kind of... I guess the thing about Lockhart is that even though it's rumored to be a launch product with the Series X, we definitely know it exists. But I question whether it's actually going to launch with the Series X. Like, I was kind of big on it when we first talked about it a few months ago, but the more time goes on, we hear absolutely zero about the Lockhart. We've seen, and I know we're deviating a little bit, so I apologize to the listeners, but we've seen a lot about the Series X, especially in the last couple of weeks. Today, especially, we saw Phil come out and kind of make a big statement about the hardware. We've seen a couple of, I'll say, trailers of next-gen games or cross-gen games that have the Series X logo down the bottom with the PS5 logo and the Steam logo and everything, but we don't see anything about the Lockhart. So I wonder if the Lockhart is not part of their initial launch plans for the next generation.
Yeah, it seems like that's a good possibility. So I guess if I were Microsoft in a situation where my manufacturing lines are being impacted by the coronavirus, I'd say, even if my plans were to have Lockhart day one, it's kind of like, what? It's not feasible right now. We can wait. We don't need it at launch.
Yep.
We just adjust those plans really quick.
The Series X has dropped to $299, which is a really good deal, by the way. I was actually thinking about getting one, even though I'm kind of against getting one at the moment, obviously. But when you drop the Series X to $299, all of a sudden that's like, wow, it's got more teraflops than a Lockhart does. So maybe that's the stopgap,
That's true. What's curious is how Nintendo's come out and they talked about the Switch situation, but Sony and Microsoft haven't expressed any concern about PlayStation 4 or Xbox One stock concern. Like, you think there's just a huge supply sitting in their warehouses and on store shelves that they're not concerned for the next few months. Because I believe when Nintendo gave out their numbers at the end of December, I think the difference between shipped and sold was somewhere in the ballpark of about 3 to 4 million units for the Switch, which means as of January 1st, Nintendo had anywhere between 3 to 4 million units in warehouses and on store shelves. But since then, like we've seen it have, really strong sale figures in Japan. They've obviously have sold units in North America and Europe. So that number has come down significantly, probably into the range of only, we'll say, 2 million more units, but with Animal Crossing coming out, next month, the introduction of the Animal Crossing Switch and even the Coral Switch, which obviously were all well in production late last year. Nintendo is, they know what they're going to have available. They are aware where they're going to have shortages, and Microsoft and Sony are they're kind of just sitting back.
Yeah, I think they probably do have a stockpile of inventory, but to that point, Last of Us 2 and Ghost of Tsushima are coming out this year. You got to think there's going to be another special edition PS4 coming out. If you're a betting man, you would say Last of Us 2 is going to get it. So, if so, then they have obviously that has to be manufactured. So I do wonder if they will actually release another special edition, or if they were going to release one, but they've quietly or silently had to cancel plans for that, and they're just going to sell off any kind of remaining stock that they have, which I think is millions and millions of systems. I don't think they're in any danger of running out, but I would say that is a safe assumption that both companies have enough stock to go at least for this year, unless Sony really wants a special edition, and then I'm not sure how that works. Maybe to your point, they kind of send that off to one of a different production center in order to get that done for them. In fact, I have no idea how they make those special editions. Do they just make the base system and then they somehow aftermarket? I don't want to say aftermarket, but they then put the design on top of it. I'm not really sure how that works, but I would think a red PS4 or a Spider-Man PS4, the plastics come out of they're manufactured that way with that color, that ink injected into the plastic. So I would say that that would have to be done at the factory.
So in summary, what would be your expectation or predictions for the industry moving forward through 2020 and the coronavirus's impacts on it if the situation does not change?
Well, I guess, in summary, I will say that I think right now that all these companies are taking the appropriate precautions. I don't think there's any reason to panic about anything at this time. I think these companies are they're just being very safe, and as they should be. This is a potentially serious situation that they're helping the entire world get under control, and they're doing their part to ensure that the virus is contained. So I think, no cause for concern there. But as far as the prediction and the summary of how things are going to play, I don't think it's going to be as bad as potentially what we've said. I don't think it's going to be catastrophic. But I do expect some delays to occur. And if I was to predict, Nate, I would say that Sony is likely going to push the PS5. I don't know how much it's going to be. Probably it's not going to be much, but maybe into early next year, into kind of February. Yep. And I think that Microsoft is probably still going to remain on track with the Series X holiday this year, but the Lockhart, as we kind of alluded to, is going to probably not happen. I think they're just going to say, look, the Series X is more than appropriate for what we need that for to do. The Lockhart will get announced at some point next year when things have kind of smoothened out for the industry. As far as games, I don't think there's any huge concern about game delays at this point. But I do think that it really is, the next, I'll say 6 weeks, is something you really want to keep a close eye on as far as where the situation is. If the perception is, or if things are starting to improve, then I would assume that everything is kind of on schedule. If things start to get worse, as far as fatalities and things like that, I would expect some delays as far as the release of video games this year.
Right. I'd co-sign on most of what you just said. I do agree with your point about the PlayStation 5. If the situation does not change, I could see Sony definitely delaying it to a spring 2021 launch. And I don't think they would really be negatively impacted by doing a launch in early 2021. We saw Nintendo find great success with that with the Nintendo Switch. I do think Microsoft would, in some way, at least launch in North America in the 2020 holiday. I don't see them giving up those holiday dollars and that, the shopping frenzy of the holidays with new hardware. As far as software, like you said, it's too early to say. We've already seen minor impacts with the Outer Worlds getting delayed. I do think we'll see another, maybe another significant delay here or there, but definitely probably less than a dozen overall. But I could see, a half dozen delays occurring due to the coronavirus if the situation doesn't change. And as far as like GDC and other media events, I do think for GDC we'll see additional companies withdraw from the event in the coming weeks. And right now, E3 is that wild card event for me. It's going to depend on whether or not Europe is able to, devise that vaccine that they've been working on. If they are able to get it out in the next, month or so, that's, it's great for everybody across the world. If no progress is made on that front, I could see E3 definitely seeing major impacts from it, because the impacts that we've seen of the coronavirus in Japan still seem to be underreported. So, that's a big wild card, even for the video game industry as a whole, because if Japan gets impacted, then we're going to see significantly more delays. You're going to see the Tokyo Game Show potentially delayed, but it's definitely a situation that it's worth monitoring. It's not a matter to joke about or a lighthearted matter to, make light of. It's a serious situation. Sony isn't using the coronavirus as a scapegoat to, buffer their way to a PlayStation 5 delay in any way. And, it's an unprecedented event in the gaming industry, and the impacts, could be major if things don't change in the coming weeks.
Yep, totally agree. And to your point, it's just video games,
Right.
If there are delays, don't worry about it. Just jump into your backlog and enjoy what you have.
Right. Jump in the backlog, play the games you have, enjoy life, and just remember, it's just video games at the end of the day.
Definitely.
It's just entertainment.
That's right.
And with that, we have come to the conclusion of today's show. So I'd like to thank MVG for joining us once again.
Thanks for having me on again, Nate. It's always been fun chit-chatting. And
it's always a pleasure to have you.
Hopefully you'll have me back on the next one.
Yeah, we'll have to, think about that. Everyone else, let us know your thoughts on this topic in the comment section below. Share your thoughts. Be sure to read them. And until next time, continue to embrace the hate.